Dear students, welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Rakesh Thakur, Associate Professor teaching in Postgraduate Government College Sector 11 Chandigarh, and today's module is about conceptualizing globalization and poverty. People have generally celebrated globalization as a cure for all that ails the global society. In today's module, I would try to re-emphasize that all is not hunky-dory with the process of globalization. Globalization has, in many ways, in its attempt to reduce poverty, reduce the gap between the have and the have-nots, at times have increased it. Thus, it is important to locate the human being as central to the process of globalization. Are they the beneficiary or are they at the receiving end? Is the gap widening or is the gulf being bridged? These are the questions that we are going to answer and understand today in globalization and poverty. Let's begin the lesson. Globalization is a multi-dimensional process which came into existence in the 19th century, notably in the ideas of Karl Marx. But it has been in the last 3 or 4 decades back that globalization has entered the popular imagination in a really big way. Globalization is often related to economic terms. Some associates this with modernization or leaning more towards westernization. Globalization leads to movement of people, cultural changes, new trade practices, and interconnectedness among various countries, both economically and politically. Globally, globalization is taken as challenge to government in international affairs and global economy. Globalization is a process in which the barriers to cross-border flows are being reduced, not just for economic flows, but also for global extension of knowledge, information, belief system, ideas, and values. It is an outcome of technological advances which is fired by easily available, advanced, and cheap communication system. Globalization is not a single concept that can be defined and encompassed within a set time frame, nor is it a process that can be defined clearly with a beginning and an end. It includes economic integration, the exchange of policies across borders, the knowledge transmission and cultural stability. It is a global process, a concept, a revolution that has been studied and defined many times over the years, with some connotation referring to progress, development and stability, integration and cooperation, and other referring to regression, colonialism, destabilization. Despite these challenges, globalizations bring with it a multitude of challenges. Let's now look at some definitions of globalization. According to Rudd Lubbers, the emergence of a global economy compels national government to reappraise their assumptions of economic governance, and in doing so to adopt a more systematic approach to the implementation of socio-economic policies. At the same time, the new global economy also demands a reconsideration of the role of international institutions like GATT, WTO, IMF, OECD, NATO, WEU, United Nations as fashioners and sustainers of the ground rules for numerous international transactions in the domains of security, human rights, and sustainable development. According to Stiglitz, globalization is the removal of barriers to free trade and the closer integration of national economies. According to Giddens, who is a sociologist, globalization is the intensification of worldwide social relations that link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away, and vice versa. It is not only one of the most used but also one of the most misused and confused terms in present situation. Poverty. After understanding what we mean by globalization, let's try and understand poverty and thus think what are the interlinkages between poverty and globalization. Poverty is general scarcity or dearth or the state of one who lacks a certain amount of material possession or money. It is a multifaceted concept which includes social, economic, and political elements. Poverty seems to be chronic or temporary, and most of the time it is closely related to inequality. As a dynamic concept, poverty is changing and adapting according to consumption patterns, social dynamics, and technological change. Poverty refers to a situation when an individual cannot provide for himself with the minimum subsistence essential for survival in a society. According to United Nations, fundamentally, poverty is the inability of getting choices and opportunity, a violation of human dignity. It means lack of basic capacity to participate effectively in society. It means not having enough to feed and clothe for a family, not having a school or a clinic to go to, not having the land on which to grow one's food or a job to earn one's living, and not having access to credit. It means insecurity, powerlessness, and exclusion of individuals, households, and communities. It means susceptibility to violence, and it often implies living in marginal or fragile environment without access to clean water or sanitation. Let's now understand the interlinkages between globalization and poverty. It is very crucial but important task to understand globalization and its impact on self and identity. There are various aspects related to globalization such as demographic, economic, ecological, and political interconnection on a global scale which impacts everyday life of people in the entire world. Globalization is a process which generates debates across the political and ideological spectrum. So, as far as industrialized countries are concerned, there is a fear of current financial crisis that the dual forces of technological change and global shifts in the location of economic activities are adversely transforming employment prospects. Now let's undertake a discussion on conflicting perspective on globalization. There are two viewpoints which make globalization a highly conflicting and debatable topic. Let's look pro-globalizers or neoliberals. Those who are on the right and look at globalization as an ideological project that will bring the greatest benefit. The ideology of efficient, free, and market regardless of national boundaries should be introduced both in trade and finance. Although the neoliberal pro-globalizers recognize that such a state of perfection has not yet been achieved, the major problem in their view is that there is too little rather than too much globalization. For them, globalization is the solution to the world's economic problem and inequalities. The second kind of thinkers are known as hyper-globalizers. Those globalized who are on the left and called as anti-globalizers. For them, globalization is the problem and not the solution. The introduction of free market regardless of national boundaries as claimed by beneficent by the right regard as the main problem by them. According to them, they are the malign and destructive forces. Free market inevitably create an inequality which ultimately leads to poverty. Though through the extension of free markets by globalization, there will be an increase in the scale and extent of inequalities. A regularization of market must be there for wider interest. Unregulated market thus leads to a reduction in well-being for all, but a small minority in the world as well as creating massive environment problem. To some anti-globalists, the only solution is elimination of globalization process. Now we will be discussing factors which led to poverty due to globalization. Let's look at this factor. It's very important to understand that more so in our contemporary situation. Differing rates of population growth between the rich and the poor, whether between countries or within the country. At the beginning of the 21st century, the world's population reached a total of 6.1 billion. 100 years, it was less than 2 billion. The downward movement of commodity prices affecting the poor countries more than the rich, and the different capacities, education, access to technology, etc., that enable some to take more advantage of opportunities than others. Skewed income distribution has various repercussions, whether within a country or between countries. It leads to political instabilities and migration of people from rich to poor areas. Unequal distribution of income is often a reflection of unequal access to the economic opportunities in society. Global inequality of income distribution is also a matter of concern. Economist Robert Wade points out that globally, the richest 20% of the population garner about 85% of the world's income, and the bottom 60% accounts for 6%. This is a very high concentration of income. The urban population of the world is estimated to increase by 4.98 billion by 2030. On the contrary, the size of the rural population is expected to grow by 2.29 by 2030. The highest rates of urban growth are now in developing countries, where the number of large cities has increased. The cities within the developing industrialized economies, urban growth is driven and sustained by this economic dynamism. Migration is one of the reasons, according to International Organization for Migration. The number of international migrants in the world represent only around 3% of the total global population. One of the most important outcomes of the international migration is that it created geographically dispersed communities called as transnational migrant communities, particularly in developed countries. Let's look at some of the positive effects of globalizing process on developing country. To begin with, higher export. It helps to generate income, promotes investment in productive capacity with a potentially positive local development impact depending on inter-elected and inter-firm linkages. The ability to maintain competitiveness is another bonus. Employment growth is relatively labor-intensive and it causes an increase in overall employment or reduction of employment in lower wage sector. Either of these outcomes tends to increase wages. Exposure to new technology leads to improvement in skills and labor productivity, which facilitate the upgrading of industry into more value-added output while either enabling further wage growth or relaxing the downward pressure. The considerable increase in employment and thus in wages leads to reduced social inequality if the social structure, political institution, and social policies play a vital role. The rule governing globalization favors developed country, while the developing country sinks even lower. This is one of the main negative effects of globalizing process. Let's look at the other negative consequences. Globalization only regards monetary value of items rather than other factor involves, one being the environment. Developing countries are controlled by globalization and it has its negative effect on their democracies. Developing countries borrow a large amount of funds from other countries and the World Bank, which essentially causes them to give up the benefits of their democracy because of the strings attached to the loan repayment. The notion that it does not live up to its original expectations. Globalization was advertised to boost countries economically. However, it has not shown improvement in the developed nor developing country. The new system of globalization has basically forced a new economic system on developing country. This new economic system is seen as the Americanization of their policy as well as culture. This has caused quite a bit of resentment and financial damage. And let me now summarize in the end. Globalizing process do not just happen. They depend on different structures or scaffolds to make the process possible. There is a heated debate about the true effect of globalization and if it really is such a good thing. Though there isn't much argument as to whether or not it is happening. Globalization is the process of increased interconnectedness among countries, most notably in the areas of economics, politics and culture. Globalization plays a very important role in deciding every country's fate. It leads to a greater access to foreign culture in the form of movies, music, food, clothing and more. In short, the world has more choices. It helps in economic and social development of a country. Due to globalization, governments are able to work better towards common goal, that there is an advantage in cooperation and improved ability to interact and coordinate and a global awareness. Though globalization helps in better job opportunities, but while it provides jobs to a population in one country, it takes away these jobs from another country, leaving many without opportunities. And it also leads to different cultures from across and around the world to interact. They begin to melt and the contours and individuality of each begins to fade. Many economists and world leaders agree that globalization is supposed to create higher living standard, increase access to foreign market, more foreign investment and open borders. But former World Bank chief economist and Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz argues that globalization is desperately failing the 80% of the world's population that lives in developing countries and 40% among them that lives in poverty. Most people find the concept attractive but have now begun to see problems when it comes down to their jobs, communities and nation. Various challenges that nation and individual face are global in nature, presenting opportunities and difficulties in global solution. Thus, globalization has its supporters and its detractors. In conclusion, I would like to say that we saw during this module that the world was divided into two parts, the developed world and the developing countries. We saw that how after World War II, when a lot of newly independent countries wanted to become developed, poverty was a big thing which was afflicting their population. There were many attempts made by international agencies, people from the developed world, social scientists, but till this date, when we are post MDG, Millennium Development Goal, poverty still remains the problem. As a student of social science, it becomes imperative to understand that with the increase in the pace of globalization, old forms of poverty may be becoming non-existent, but in that place, new kind of poverties are coming through. So it is in this awareness that poverty needs to be handled by the government, by the civil society with all its might. Thank you.